Now, Mary Church Terrell was one of the other founders of the NACW with St. Pierre Ruffin. And she was the daughter of one of the South's first African American millionaires, and one of the first Black women to receive a bachelor's and master's at Oberlin College. And she was the one to make the motto, which I will talk about here shortly. But that motto, lifting as we climb, which is right here. So lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving and hoping that the buds and blossoms of our desires will burst into glorious fruition ere long. So she was able to develop the NACW's motto, and she becomes a very famous activist for anti-lynching with Ida B. Wells, who we're going to talk about as one of the most famous suffragettes. But what we have is the death of Thomas Moss, as well as Calvin McDowell and Will Stewart in 1892, and he is lynched with several other figures by a group of white men because his business competed with others. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about Ida B. Wells, because she has a bigger part in sort of his story as a whole. But we do have the lynching and murder of her friend, which causes her to sort of join up and to be part of the suffragettes and abolitionist movement, as well as the anti-lynching movement. She was one of the actually few members, a Black woman who was allowed into the NAWSA meetings and became an active voice in the organization. And it's believed that this was maybe in part because she had lighter skin, that she was able to connect with white women more, and kind of get away with not being so Black for the racist women in the group, however that may be, even though she was unhappy with the NAWSA's treatment of Black women and suffrage. But she also did picket with the National Women's Party outside of the White House, so with Alice Paul as well. When the members of the association were registering their protest against a certain injustice, I arose and said, as a colored woman, I hope this association will include in their resolution in the injustices of various kinds, of which colored people are the victims. From the platform, Susan B. Anthony asked if she was an NAWSA member. Terrell replied, no, I am not, but I thought you might be willing to listen to a plea of justice from by an outsider. Happily, she reported, Miss Anthony invited me to come forward, write out the resolution which I wished incorporated with the others, and handed it to the Committee on Resolutions, and thus became a delightful, helpful friendship. So she was a friend of Susan B. Anthony as well. She was also another famous orator, and what you see is that all of these very famous female figures who get sort of educated and then become sort of a larger part of the abolitionist movement in their writing and speaking as well. So she comes to talk about a lot of the issues that Black women are facing. Please stop using the word. We are the only human beings in the world with 57 variety of complexions who are classed together as a single racial unit. Therefore, we are really truly colored people, and that is the only name in the English language which is accurate to describe us. It is impossible for any white person in the United States, no matter how sympathetic and broad, to realize what life would mean to him if his incentive to effort were suddenly snatched away. To the lack of incentive in effort, which is the awful shadow under which we live, may be traced the wreck and ruin of a score of colored youth. Seeing their children touched and seared and wounded by race prejudice is one of the heaviest crosses which colored women have to bear. She often talked about the suffering of sort of Black mothers as well, and what that meant in sort of the lynching campaigns, as wives and mothers lost valuable family members. And she writes a very famous book called A Colored Woman in a White World, in which she talks about some of these issues as well. Now, this one is absolutely insanely phenomenal, that she continues to protest late into her life. Here she is in 1950, which is very heavily approaching the second wave of feminism. So here's her on the left. I think this is like a paper cutout of her. That's what it looks like to me, as well as her here. And in 1950, she walks into Thompson's restaurant in Washington, D.C., and she walked in with a group of white and black figures, but as they began to order, the waiter clarified that they did not serve colored people. She asked, "Do you mean to tell me that you are not going to serve me?" And they indeed clarified that that was true. She had done this entirely on purpose, as a law in 1872 bars segregation in restaurants. And so what ends up happening is that she takes them to court. And the Supreme Court eventually rules to end segregation in restaurants in 1953, in part because of this protest in Washington, D.C. And so she becomes this massive figure, not only in the suffragette movement and after women are given suffrage, but in part as of segregation as well. And here she is in the middle. Mary Ann Shaddy Carey was another famous American and Canadian anti-slavery activist, and the first black publisher in North America and Canada. She moves to Pennsylvania with her family when it was illegal to teach black children in Delaware. And in 1848, she kind of gains her fame when Frederick Douglass asked readers in his newspaper, The Northern Star, to offer suggestions to improve the life of African Americans. She was only 25, but stated we should do more and talk less, which, again, very poignant. She wrote about her father's place in Canadian politics and how there was too much talking with little reaction. And so she founds an anti-slavery paper in 1853 after Douglass sort of publishes this and grows very fond of her. And she publishes this paper, The Provincial Freeman, in 1853 in Canada. She moves back and forth from the United States to Canada during the Civil War as well, speaking against slavery and advocating for full racial integration. And she does come back to study at the Howard University of Law School, and at the age of 60 in 1883 became the second female attorney in the country, which is such a crazy and phenomenal thing to do at 60 years old. I'm like tired now. And she goes on to develop the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise Association in 1880. And she actually joins the NWSA, ironically enough, but continues sort of her fight for suffrage. I would easily say that Ida B. Wells is my favorite figure in sort of the suffrage movement as a whole. Such a crazy courageous figure, and her story is just absolutely insane. So I wrote a lot about her, as you can imagine, and she has sort of a lot of poignant moments, and she's sort of a really powerful figure historically as well. And so she was born a slave in Mississippi in 1862 and emancipated in 65 because of the Emancipation Proclamation. She loses her parents and a brother in 78 to yellow fever when she was 16 years old, and she moves in with her grandmother and continues to take care of her siblings and write for several newspapers, reporting on incidents of racial segregation and inequality. At 24, she wrote, "I will not begin at this late day by doing what my soul abhors, sugaring men, weak, deceitful creatures, with flattery to retain them as escorts or to gratify a revenge," which is quite spiteful and powerful for a 24-year-old. Sorry, I went too far back somehow. She has a lot of very famous moments in her history, one of them being a lawsuit against Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad in May 4th of 1884. A train conductor ordered Wells to give up her seat in the first-class ladies' cars and to move to the smoking car, which was already crowded with other passengers. And the previous year, the Supreme Court had ruled against the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1875, which had banned racial discrimination in public accommodations. And so this verdict supported the railroad companies to racially segregate, but Wells did refuse to give up her seat. The conductor and two men dragged her out of the car. Wells gained publicity in Memphis when she wrote the newspaper article The Living Way about her treatment, and she hired I believe she originally hired she originally hires a white attorney who gets paid off by the railroad. And so she goes back and hires a black attorney. And she does win her case in 1884 in local court and receives $500. Unfortunately, the railroad company appealed it in Tennessee Supreme Court, and the ruling was reversed in 1887. And then Wells is then ordered to pay court costs, which is awful. So they state, we think it is evident that the purpose of the defendant in error was to harass with a view to this suit, and that her persistence was not in good faith to obtain a comfortable seat for a short ride. And she stated, I feel so disappointed because I had hoped such great things for my suit, for my people. Oh God, is there no justice in this land for us? And again, she's quite young at this time. I want to say 25. Let me do math. Hold on. So she was indeed 25 years old. And so this reaction from the court really sort of resigned her to her convictions on civil rights and religious faith as well. Or not resigned, but strengthened, that is. So like I previously stated, along with Mary Church Terrell, she was really focused on the brutality of lynching because of the lynching of Thomas Moss, her friend, in 1992. As I stated previously, Thomas Moss was lynched. He had a grocery, the People's Grocery, and him, along with two other figures, were arrested and lynched without sort of reason in owning this sort of black grocery. And he says before he is lynched, "Tell my people to go west. There is no justice here." And of course, they were lynched by a mob. And this was very much part of Southern justice at the time, that even though they go to jail and they're supposed to be awaiting trial, that these groups take them out and kill them and consider it some kind of justice, that they're using their own form of justice to do this. And so after this occurs, this is Ida B. Wells with Betty Moss, who is the widow of Thomas Moss. I believe one of her kids was born after the lynching here as well, which is quite tragic. So Wells becomes very sort of empowered by what has occurred and starts making these very radical anti-lynching pamphlets and newspapers and investigating claims by white people who claim to be only lynching quote-unquote black criminals. And so she starts publishing works such as Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, that documented and protested lynching in the 1890s. There's also the Free Speech and Headlight, which did this as well. The city of Memphis has demonstrated that neither character nor standing avails if he dares to protect himself against the white man or become his rival. There is nothing we can do about the lynching now, as we are outnumbered and without arms. The white mob could help itself to ammunition without pay, but the order is rigidly enforced against the selling of guns. There is therefore only one thing left to do: save our money and leave a town which will neither protect our lives and property, nor give us a fair trial in the courts, but take us out and murder us in cold blood when accused by white persons. And people did in fact leave Memphis because of what she wrote. Even though she stayed and continued to write against them, a lot of people did actually leave the city because of it. It continued to ramp up further with this wrongful conviction of William Offutt over a sexual affair with Julia Underwood, who was a married white woman. She willingly had sex with William Offutt, and when her husband returned home, she decided to claim that he had tried to rape her, and thus he was put on trial and convicted and put in jail for some time, I believe for 4 years. And even though he denied raping her, so 4 years, that's correct. She ended up did tell her husband that he did not rape her, and they worked to get him out of jail. But Ida B. Wells was horrified by this and said that it was many of the numerous problems surrounding Black men and them being lynched as a whole. On May 21st, 1892, Wells published another editorial in the Free Speech refuting what she called the old threadbare lie that men rape white women. If Southern men are not careful, a conclusion might be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. 4 days later, you have different articles coming out in different white supremacist groups that are condemning Ida B. Wells. The fact that a Black scoundrel is allowed to live and utter such loathsome and repulsive calumnies is a volume of evidence as to the wonderful patience of Southern whites, but we've had enough of it. The Evening Skimter copied the story that same day, but added, patience under such circumstances is not a virtue. If themselves do not apply the remedy without delay, it will be the duty of those whom he has attacked to tie the wretch who utters those calumnies to a stake at the intersection of Main and Madison streets, brand him on the forehead with a hot iron, and perform upon him a surgical operation with a pair of tailor's shears, which is quite horrific as well. So eventually, within that same year of 1892, Ida B. Wells, her publishing, where she was publishing and working, was burned to the ground, and she was forced to leave town sort of in fear for her life, as this sort of white mob destroyed her work. So although she continued to talk about anti-lynching, she wouldn't continue to do it in Memphis for fear that she would be murdered because of it. She wrote in her autobiography, which I think is very poignant to how she talks about and thinks about lynching. She says, a finer, cleaner man that he never walked the streets of Memphis. The colored people feel that every white man in Memphis who consented in his death is as guilty as those who fired the guns which took his life. That is what opened my eyes to what lynching really was, an excuse to get rid of those who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized and keep them down. Wells exposed lynching as a barbaric practice of whites in the South used to intimidate and oppress Black men and others who created economic and political competition, a subsequent threat of loss of power for whites. And so not only did Ida B. Wells write against this sort of narrative of Black men raping white women, which was causing the death of so many Black men in this sort of larger narrative, but that it was mostly sort of an excuse for white men to murder their literal sort of competition in the economy, right? To be able to keep white men rich, they continued to kill off Black men. And she said it was not only racism, but or also this sort of reason for economic gain as well. Which I think is quite revolutionary, honestly, to hear her talk about this in the 1870s, and that I haven't ever heard this before, or 1890s, that is, until I learned about Ida B. Wells. She does move from Memphis to New York to Chicago in 1893 after being threatened, and marries Ferdinand Lee Barnett in 1895, who was widowed and had 2 sons, and then they went on to have 4 children of their own, which is here on the left. They are so cute. I love this girl in the center. She makes me laugh every time I look at it. So you will also see Ida B. Wells referred to as Ida B. Wells -Barnett. And, oh, here's some more pictures of her and her children. During this time, you have the Niagara movement that is developing and considering themselves sort of the mighty current of change, which is why they call themselves the Niagara movement, like Niagara Falls. And you have Mrs. Mary B. Talbert, who's working to develop the NAACP, of which Ida B. Wells is also a large part. So this is coming into development, and Ida B. Wells is a large part of that. Talbert writes in 1915, it should not be necessary to struggle forever against popular prejudice, and with us as colored women, this struggle becomes twofold. First, because we are women, and second, because we are colored women. So Ida B. Wells helps to form the NAACP with, I I totally just lost her name, Talbert, and other figures as well. And it's very much headed by Frederick Douglass, who does die in 1895. And so at this point, Ida B. Wells was at the height of her career and notoriety, but other people thought she was too radical and felt more comfortable with Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois being the new leader. And so, to the point that Du Bois, who did not like her, left her name off of the development of the NAACP. He apparently said it was by accident. She said there was no possible way that could have happened. So he did keep her off of that, of the list of original founders of this group. Ida B. Wells continues to speak at different conventions, and she bumps into A. Frances Willard when they are both going to talk in Britain about women's suffrage. Willard coming to talk about temperance and suffrage as part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and Wells comes to talk about lynching. Willard very much thinking that a lot of the issues with women's suffrage and sort of issues with men in general is that of alcohol. Now, Wells comes to speak out against her and kind of says it to her face at this convention because of a particular interview that Willard did, which is here featured, The Race Problem, in which she I have here. Wells took a particular issue with an 1890 interview Willard gave to New York newspaper The Voice, in which she made statements that vilified black men and implied they were dangerous to white women, the very sentiments lynchers used to justify their murders of black men. Among Willard's remarks was, the colored race multiplies like locusts of Egypt. The grog shop is its center of power. The safety of women, of childhood, of the home, is menaced in 1,000 localities at this moment. In Wells' words, Willard had unhesitantly slandered the entire race in order to gain favor with those who are hanging, shooting, and burning them alive. Again, this is continued by a lot of different sort of these racist white suffragettes that continue to sort of use racial stereotypes to keep both men and women down, as black women are quote unquote sexually immoral and available to men, and black women being sort of vulnerable to assault, along with black men raping white women. And so Wells came out to very much sort of talk about these issues and confront people who were speaking in support of them. During this time, she also went to then form the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago in 1913, which taught black women how to vote and how to teach black women to engage in civic matters and to elect different figures to city offices. They helped in electing Oscar DePriest to be the first black alderman in Chicago. It was also very much for women who felt excluded from the NAWSA. Because as you can imagine, 1913 may seem like a familiar date, as it is when the March on Washington happened with the National Women's Party movement and Alice Paul. And during this March on Washington, black women were asked to walk at the back. And as you can imagine, Wells was furious. There was this sort of desire to accommodate their Southern members, and thus they wanted them to stand at the back in the segregated section for black women. Ida B. Wells, in attendance with members from Chicago, refused to acquiesce and instead waited with spectators as the demonstration got underway before joining the parade by stepping into white Chicago delegation and marching with them. I believe this is Friedman. She compares her to Rosa Parks, in that she did not give up her seat in the train, as well as she would not take this spot in the back of the line. Bystanders on that day, more than a century ago, would have seen her emerge from the crowd and take her place between two white delegates, striding into history. She even sort of linked arms with the other other white suffragettes from Chicago. So you can see her here walking amongst the group of white voters, sort of unabashedly, which is crazy phenomenal. And I'm glad that she was not harmed, because you never know what could have occurred at that time. There are a lot of different cartoons that kind of talk about some of these ideas as well. I saw this one. Just like the men votes for white women, as they called for black women to stand at the back. Ida B. Wells continued to work during World War I, even though she was called a race traitor. But she still continued to do sort of her anti-lynching work, as well as suffragette works, in that we still have black women and men being kept from voting. So she became a very important figure to this movement as a whole. And I would say really one of the founding figures of a lot of different movements and ideas as well.